Before a verdict is rendered in this case, I'll have you disbarred." Judge Harris slammed his gavel down hard and snarled. Jamal stood motionless, his heart thumping in his chest, and the courtroom gasped. How had things gotten so out of hand? He had only offered a basic piece of evidence, but now he was confronted with what seemed to be the full force of the legal system. "You have no right," Jamal said in a shaky but determined voice. "I haven't done anything improper. Just because you dislike the truth doesn't mean you can keep me quiet." The judge leaned forward, his cheeks turning a startling shade of red. "The truth is what I say it is in my courtroom. Think of this as your last warning." Jamal was hearing things he couldn't believe. He had worked for years to establish his worth, conquering challenges along the way. In addition to winning cases, he had studied law to guarantee justice for small company owners like Mr. Thompson, who lacked the means to defend themselves against dishonest multinationals. Now, however, it seemed that his greatest adversary was the system itself. This was not always the case. Jamal had been self-assured only a few weeks prior. He was advancing in his career. He had gained the respect of his peers by taking on and winning several challenging cases. "You're living proof that no matter where we come from, we can make something of ourselves," his mother would often tell him, expressing her pride in him. Living in a rough neighborhood, he was surrounded by individuals who didn't think a young person like him could ever pursue a career in law. Jamal, however, had overcome the odds. He had worked his way through law school, frequently working many jobs to pay for his tuition. Although his path had been difficult, it had only strengthened his will to succeed. He was now working for Mr. Thompson, a guy who had been wrongly sued by a big company that had chosen to shut down his modest company. Jamal was resolved to be the slingshot, since he had immediately seen that this was a classic David versus Goliath situation. Judge Harris, however, had other ideas. Jamal had known something was up from the start. The judge appeared to be giving the opposing counsel much greater latitude, interrupted him frequently, and hardly gave him a glance when he talked. Jamal didn't want to accept the allegations he had heard about Judge Harris, which included whispers that he didn't like minority attorneys. Nevertheless, it was getting harder to ignore the trend. The judge would interrupt Jamal every time he attempted to speak, frequently with a snide comment. At one early hearing, Judge Harris had the entire audience laugh at Jamal's expense by saying, "Counselor, if you don't know what you're doing, perhaps you should let someone else take over." Although it had hurt, Jamal had maintained his composure. He was aware that losing his temper in front of the court was not something he could afford. For both his client and his own career, the stakes were too high. He had to figure out how to change the situation, but Judge Harris was getting in his way every step of the way. Then the moment that made all the difference arrived. Jamal was getting ready for what he anticipated would be a case-changing development on a Friday afternoon. He felt certain that he and his client, Mr. Thompson, could demonstrate that the corporation had broken the terms of their contract after spending hours reviewing the material. However, he sensed that something was amiss as soon as he walked inside the courtroom. As Mr. Davis, the opposing lawyer, strode to the stage with assurance, Judge Harris sat on the bench grinning. "Your Honor," Davis started, "I would like to make a fresh motion to dismiss this case on the grounds that the defense has not presented enough evidence before we move forward." Jamal's heart fell. A dismissal motion. This was absurd. They still hadn't made their entire argument. He sprang to his feet, ready to protest, when Judge Harris interrupted him. The judge waved his hand and said, "Overruled." "Let's listen to the movement." Jamal found it hard to believe. How could the judge possibly take this into account? They hadn't even examined every piece of evidence. Knowing full well that Judge Harris would allow the request, Jamal raged in silence while Mr. Davis babbled on about how his case lacked merit. The judge had obviously already made up his decision before any arguments were made. Judge Harris gave Mr. Davis a nod of approval when he was done. He muttered, "I've heard enough," as his scornful gaze shifted to Jamal. "You have been squandering the time of this court, counselor. I'm giving the idea of dropping this lawsuit significant thought." Jamal got to his feet, his hands trembling a little. The injustice of it all felt oppressive, yet he knew he had to maintain his cool. With all due respect, Your Honor, there is validity to this case. We have not yet presented all of our evidence in the unjust lawsuit against my client. It is only right that the court hears all of the evidence before rendering a judgment. Judge Harris smiled smugly as he sat back in his chair. All right, you say. Do you believe that this court should treat you fairly? Jamal took a deep breath. Indeed, Your Honor. Justice is something I believe in. The judge's gaze grew strained. Justice? Counselor, this has nothing to do with justice. It has to do with the law. And it appears that you don't comprehend it from where I sit. A burst of wrath swept through Jamal. How could the judge have been so egregiously unjust? However, an unforeseen event occurred before he could utter any word. A woman in her 50s with a sharp eye and a no-nonsense manner raised her hand as one of the jurors. Her voice broke the tension in the room as she remarked, "Pardon me, Your Honor. I don't believe that the lawsuit should be dismissed before all the facts have been heard. The entire argument has not yet been heard." The judge's expression became tense. He yelled, "The jury doesn't control the proceedings." However, the harm had already been done. The courtroom was filled with whispering as a number of other jurors nodded in accord. Jamal found it hard to believe. The jury might have been on his side. Judge Harris sighed after glaring at the jurors and then at Jamal. "All right, we'll go on. But you had better hurry, counselor." With his heart pounding, Jamal took a seat. He understood that the lifeline that had just been offered to him would not last. The judge was enraged and would take advantage of any chance to silence him. Jamal had to come up with a plan quickly. Over the course of the following few days, Jamal felt the burden of the entire trial. He was continuously interrupted and undermined by Judge Harris, making every moment in the courtroom a struggle. Everyone in the courtroom could sense the intense tension between them. Even the court reporters exchanged uncomfortable looks whenever the judge made a snarky remark, because it was so clear how biased he was. Meanwhile, with the judge's backing, Mr. Davis had become more brash. During his cross-examinations, he had started making fun of Jamal directly, teasing him about how inexperienced he appeared to be, or how perhaps this case is too big for someone fresh out of law school. Jamal was fuming on the inside, but he tried not to show it. Mr. Thompson, his client, took note. "Are you all right, Jamal?" One day, as they were leaving the court, he inquired. "You seem to be getting a rough time from the judge." Jamal gave a firm nod. "I'm all right, Mr. Thompson. We will prevail in this." However, concerns started to surface even as he spoke the words. Judge Harris was making every effort to undermine their argument. The odds were stacked against them in every courtroom decision, objection, and exchange. Then, when it appeared that things couldn't get any worse, they did. Jamal had just completed cross-examining a crucial witness on one very contentious court day when Judge Harris abruptly called for a recess. Jamal heard the judge's voice while he was assembling his documents. "Counselor, a word in my chambers," he said. Jamal felt sick to his stomach. This isn't possible. With a loud click, the heavy door behind them closed as he followed the judge into his chambers. The judge took a seat behind his desk and gave Jamal a chilly, calculating gaze. "Don't you think you're smart?" The judge spoke in a low, menacing voice. "You believe you can humiliate me by entering my courtroom?" Jamal started to object, but the judge stopped him with a wave of his hand. "I've been in this business for a while, so I can tell when someone is attempting to pull a fast one. Counselor, let me be absolutely clear. I don't care how much proof you have. This case is concluded. You will not prevail." Jamal could feel the pounding of his heart. "Your Honor, what are you saying? Before we have presented all the evidence, you cannot just determine the matter." The judge had a glimmer of hate in his eyes. "In my courtroom, I am free to do anything I choose. You would be wise to keep it in mind." Jamal's thoughts were racing. This exceeded his expectations. In addition to being biased, Judge Harris made a concerted effort to end the case. However, how could Jamal defend himself? He would be jeopardizing his client's case, his reputation, and his career if he charged the judge of corruption without any supporting evidence. The judge lowered his voice to a whisper and leaned forward. "Go now, counselor. If you drop out of the case, I might let you keep your license. You'll regret pushing me." With the danger weighing heavily on his mind, Jamal walked out of the chambers in a stupor. Winning was no longer the only goal. It was a matter of survival. However, a new resolution started to emerge in his chest, even as the fear took hold of him. He had no intention of giving up. He was unable to. Even Jamal was shocked by his own composure when he entered the courtroom the next day. The judge's threat hovered over him, but it strengthened his resolve rather than made him fearful. The focus of this lawsuit shifted from his client to exposing the unfairness that Judge Harris stood for. Jamal had been planning the night before. He was aware that he would want more than his own word in order to defeat Judge Harris. He required unquestionable evidence of the judge's corruption and bias. Then he discovered it while going over his notes. Cross-examination was the pivotal moment. A former employee of the company, who had worked on the disputed contracts, was summoned to the stand by Jamal. Jamal gently changed the subjects of his questions to something that had been plaguing him for days as the witness testified. He inquired as to whether the witness had ever spoken with Judge Harris face-to-face outside of court. The witness hesitated, looking anxiously at the judge, and the room fell silent. Jamal continued. "Sir, you are sworn in. Before the trial started, did you ever speak with Judge Harris about this case?" The witness's face became white as he stumbled. "I think I may have said something, but it was merely informal. Nothing significant." Jamal's heart was pounding. He had him. "And what specifically did you and the judge talk about?" Judge Harris's face became frighteningly crimson. "Rebuttal." He slammed his gavel and yelled. "This line of inquiry is inappropriate and irrelevant." However, it was too late. There was a lot of activity in the courtroom, and Jamal had the necessary power. He turned to the new judge, who had been assigned to preside over the last part of the trial following the filing of Jamal's complaint over Judge Harris's conduct. An experienced and well-respected new judge held up a hand. "Overruled. The question will be addressed by the witness." After shifting uneasily in his chair, the witness eventually said, "We might have talked about the case. For a little while. However, I didn't believe it was inappropriate." Jamal didn't have to speak again. Even the jurors appeared astonished, and murmuring filled the courtroom. The most obvious and public way conceivable had revealed Judge Harris's partiality. The judge was compelled to promptly withdraw from the case when his reputation was damaged. Jamal found it hard to believe. The tide was finally turning after weeks of battling an uphill struggle. Judge Harris's corruption was exposed for everyone to see, and the truth had been revealed. The mood in the courtroom totally changed when Judge Harris was removed from the case and the new judge took charge of the trial. Jamal was able to breathe for the first time in weeks. After hearing both sides with great attention, the new judge allowed Jamal to finally submit the entire body of evidence that had been concealed by Harris's biased decisions. The trial's last several days passed quickly. The truth overcame the corporation's lies, and Jamal's case was unquestionable. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous decision in support of Mr. Thompson. Jamal had a sense of relief as the judge read the verdict out loud. He had succeeded. He had triumphed in the lawsuit against all odds. But more significantly, he had exposed the truth and challenged a dishonest system. With tears of appreciation in his eyes, Mr. Thompson shook Jamal's hand outside the courthouse. "Jamal, you saved my company. I'm not sure how to express my gratitude." With a great sense of joy and achievement, Jamal grinned. He said, "You don't have to thank me. I was just carrying out my duties." However, winning the case was only one aspect of the victory. The legal community was rocked by Jamal's battle with Judge Harris. As soon as word got out about the judge's prejudice and wrongdoing, an inquiry of his prior decisions was started. In addition to securing justice for his client, Jamal had assisted in the downfall of a dishonest individual who had been abusing his position of authority for years. Jamal's notoriety skyrocketed in the weeks that followed. He gained not only a reputation as a talented attorney, but also as a man who, in the face of overwhelming obstacles, stood up for what was right. Knowing that he would fight to the death for justice, fresh clients came to his law business and asked him to defend them. Judge Harris, meanwhile, had ended his career. He was immediately dismissed from the bench when the investigation into his actions revealed a pattern of bias and corruption. Despite its flaws, the legal system had at last made him answerable for his deeds. Jamal's triumph was a moral one as well as a legal one. He had demonstrated that the truth always finds a way to surface, regardless of how strong the forces against you may appear to be. Despite its slowness, justice never gives up. Moral lesson: justice is not always immediate, and it may be challenged by those in power. But truth, when pursued with courage and integrity, always prevails. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, standing up for what is right can lead to change that ripples far beyond the courtroom. Karma, in its own time, ensures that those who abuse power will face the consequences of their actions.